In 1943, Japanese pilots began encountering an American fighter unlike anything they had fought before. It was brutally fast. It could dive away from almost anything they sent after it. 6 .50 caliber machine guns gave it devastating firepower. And behind its enormous propeller sat one of the most powerful aircraft engines in the world. For the first years of the Pacific War, Japanese pilots had exploited the weaknesses of American fighters. They could outturn them, outmaneuver them, and force inexperienced pilots into battles they couldn't win. Then this aircraft appeared, and suddenly, the advantage began disappearing. But there was something those Japanese pilots couldn't have known. The United States Navy had already discovered a serious problem with its new fighter. It had been designed to operate from aircraft carriers. Yet Navy pilots found it frighteningly difficult to land on one. Its enormous nose blocked the pilot's view. Its landing gear could bounce violently when it struck the deck. And its low-speed handling could punish even experienced aviators. America had built one of the fastest and most powerful naval fighters in the world, and then discovered it wasn't ready to fight from the very ships it had been designed for. The Navy had a problem. The Marines saw an opportunity, and halfway across the world, pilots flying from even smaller carriers would discover a solution America had overlooked. And Japanese pilots were about to discover what happened when the Corsair was finally allowed to fight on its own terms. This is the story of the Vought F4U Corsair, the fighter America almost rejected before discovering just how deadly it really was. The story began in 1938. War had not yet consumed Europe, but the United States Navy could see where aviation was heading. Aircraft were becoming faster. Engines were becoming more powerful. Carrier warfare was evolving rapidly. The Navy wanted a new fighter capable of outperforming anything that might appear during the next war. And Vought responded with an unusually aggressive idea. Instead of designing a conventional fighter and finding an engine powerful enough to move it, engineers effectively built the aircraft around one of the most powerful engines they could obtain, the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, an enormous 18-cylinder radial engine capable of producing around 2,000 horsepower. For the late 1930s, that was extraordinary, but enormous power created another problem. To turn all that horsepower into thrust, the Corsair needed an enormous propeller, more than 13 feet across, and that created a serious engineering headache. A propeller that large needed considerable clearance from the ground. The obvious solution was longer landing gear. But long, thin landing gear was exactly what you didn't want on a carrier fighter. Carrier landings were violent. Aircraft slammed onto moving decks. Landing gear needed to be short, strong, compact. Vaught's engineers needed another solution. What they created would become one of the most recognizable shapes in aviation history: the inverted gull wing. Instead of extending straight outward, the wings bent downward near the fuselage before rising again toward the tips. That allowed engineers to attach shorter, stronger landing gear at the lowest point of the wing, while still giving the massive propeller enough clearance. It was unusual, it was complicated, and visually, it made the Corsair unmistakable. When the prototype first flew in 1940, it quickly demonstrated that all that engineering had produced something special. The Corsair became the first single-engine American fighter to exceed 400 miles per hour in level flight. That was an astonishing achievement. Here was an aircraft designed for carriers, moving at speeds that only a few years earlier would have seemed impossible. And speed wasn't its only advantage. The Corsair could climb aggressively. It could dive at tremendous speed. It had excellent range, and later production versions carried 650 caliber Browning machine guns in the wings. Together, they could throw a devastating stream of fire into anything unfortunate enough to cross the Corsair's gun sight. On paper, the Navy appeared to have exactly what it wanted: a fighter powerful enough to challenge anything Japan or Germany could put into the sky. Then pilots tried landing it on an aircraft carrier, and everything changed. Carrier landings are among the most difficult maneuvers in aviation. The pilot isn't approaching a stationary runway. The runway is moving, pitching, rolling, and surrounded by ocean. There is almost no margin for error. The Corsair made that already difficult task even harder. Its enormous engine and long nose severely restricted forward visibility. The cockpit sat far behind the propeller. During the final approach, pilots could struggle to see the flight deck directly ahead. That alone was dangerous. But the problems didn't stop there. Early Corsairs developed a reputation for bouncing during hard landings. The landing gear could compress and rebound, throwing the aircraft back into the air just when the pilot needed it firmly planted on the deck. A bounce could mean missing the arresting wires. Missing the wires could mean racing toward aircraft parked at the front of the carrier, or disappearing over the side. Then there were the Corsair's low-speed characteristics. Under certain conditions, one wing could stall before the other. At altitude, a pilot might recover. A few dozen feet above a carrier deck, there might not be enough time. The fighter that behaved like a monster at high speed could become dangerously unforgiving when slowed for landing. The Navy now faced an extraordinary contradiction. In the air, the Corsair appeared magnificent. Around a carrier deck, it could be frightening. This wasn't a small inconvenience. Carrier suitability was the entire reason the aircraft existed, and the Navy had another fighter coming, the Grumman F-6F Hellcat. The Hellcat wasn't as visually dramatic as the Corsair, but it offered something carrier commanders valued enormously. It was easier to operate from a flight deck. Its landing characteristics were forgiving. Its visibility was better. Its wide landing gear gave pilots confidence. And it was still fast, powerful, rugged, and heavily armed. For the Navy, the choice increasingly seemed obvious. Let the Hellcat become the primary carrier fighter, and find another job for the Corsair. For many aircraft, that decision might have ended the story. But the United States was fighting a war across thousands of miles of Pacific islands. The Marine Corps desperately needed high-performance fighters from land bases. And land bases did not have moving flight decks. They had long runways. Suddenly, the Corsair's greatest weakness mattered far less. In late 1942 and early 1943, Marine squadrons began receiving the fighter. Pilots immediately noticed its personality. The Corsair demanded respect. It was not gentle. It was not forgiving of careless flying. But once pilots learned how to handle it, the performance was extraordinary. The acceleration, the power, the speed in a dive, the ability to climb away from danger. Everything about it encouraged a different kind of combat. This was not an aircraft designed to twist endlessly through the sky. It was built to attack with overwhelming energy and leave before the enemy could respond. That distinction was about to become extremely important, because the opponent waiting for the Corsair had built its reputation around exactly the opposite philosophy. The Mitsubishi A6M0 had dominated the opening phase of the Pacific War. It was light, agile, and extraordinarily maneuverable. In the hands of an experienced Japanese pilot, it could turn inside almost every American fighter it encountered. American pilots who tried to dogfight it often learned the lesson too late. Never fight the Zero on its own terms. But avoiding that fight required speed, power, and the ability to control when combat began and when it ended. Those were exactly the qualities the Corsair possessed. In early 1943, Marine Corsairs began arriving in the Solomon Islands. No polished carrier decks, no comfortable bases, just rough island airfields surrounded by jungle and Japanese aircraft waiting beyond the horizon. The Navy had asked Vought to build one of the greatest carrier fighters in the world. Vought had delivered an aircraft the Navy was not yet ready to trust aboard its carriers. So America sent it somewhere it had never been designed to fight. A primitive island airfield in the South Pacific. And waiting for it there was the Zero. In early 1943, the confrontation the Corsair had been built for was finally about to happen. But it would not begin the way the Americans hoped. For nearly 2 years, Japanese pilots had used the Zero's extraordinary maneuverability to dominate dogfights. Now they were about to meet an American fighter built around an entirely different philosophy. The Zero wanted to turn, the Corsair wanted to attack. And whoever forced the other aircraft to fight on its terms would survive. The Corsair's combat debut was not the overwhelming success many might expect. On February 14, 1943, American fighters escorting bombers near Bougainville encountered Japanese aircraft in what became known to American aviators as the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. The Americans suffered badly. Several aircraft were lost. The Corsair had entered combat and immediately received a brutal reminder that superior performance did not guarantee victory. Japanese pilots were experienced, disciplined, deadly. Many had been fighting since the beginning of the Pacific War. The Americans could not simply climb into a faster fighter and expect the enemy to disappear. They had to learn how to use it, and they had to learn quickly. The first lesson was simple: never turn with a Zero. At lower speeds, the Japanese fighter remained extraordinarily dangerous. Its lightweight construction and large wing allowed it to change direction with astonishing speed. A Corsair pilot who became impatient and followed a Zero into a tight horizontal turn could watch the Japanese aircraft gradually move behind him. Once that happened, the Corsair's power meant very little, so marine pilots began exploiting the advantages they did possess: altitude, speed, diving performance, and horsepower. Instead of staying in a turning battle, Corsair pilots attacked from above. They dived at high speed, fired a short burst, then used their momentum to climb away. If the attack failed, they didn't turn around immediately. They extended, regained altitude, and attacked again. The Corsair wasn't there to dance with the Zero. It was there to hit it like a hammer. That changed the fight completely. The Zero had been designed around extreme maneuverability, but achieving that performance required sacrifices. Weight had been removed wherever possible. Armour protection was limited. Early versions lacked self-sealing fuel tanks. That made the aircraft extraordinarily light, but also vulnerable. The Corsair represented almost the opposite philosophy. It was large, heavy, powerful, and armed with 6 Browning .50 caliber machine guns. A short burst could be devastating. Corsair pilots didn't need to remain behind a Zero for long. They needed only a few seconds, sometimes less. The Corsair also had another advantage Japanese pilots quickly learned to respect. It could dive fast, extremely fast. If a Corsair pilot found himself in trouble, he could push the nose down and convert altitude into speed. The heavier American fighter accelerated rapidly. A Zero attempting to follow could encounter severe control problems as speed increased. That gave American pilots an escape route they hadn't always possessed earlier in the war. A Corsair pilot didn't need to win every engagement. He needed to know when to leave. Soon, the results began changing. The disastrous first encounters gave way to increasingly successful operations. Marine pilots learned the aircraft. They learned the enemy. And most importantly, they stopped trying to prove the Corsair could beat the Zero at everything. It couldn't. The Zero could still kill a careless Corsair pilot. But getting the Corsair into the position where it could be killed was becoming much harder. The aircraft's toughness also began building its reputation. Combat in the Solomon Islands was brutal on machines. Runways were rough. Maintenance facilities were primitive. Heat and humidity punished engines. Salt air attacked metal. Spare parts weren't always available. Then there was enemy fire. Corsairs returned from missions with holes punched through their wings and fuselages. Some came back leaking fluids. Others landed with damaged control surfaces. Yet the aircraft often brought its pilot home. The massive radial engine helped. Unlike a liquid-cooled engine, where a single hit to the cooling system could eventually cause failure, the R2800 could sometimes continue operating despite significant damage. For pilots flying hundreds of miles over jungle and ocean, that mattered enormously. Confidence grew, and so did the Corsair's reputation. Japanese pilots began encountering the bent wing fighter more frequently across the Solomons. The Corsair's silhouette was unmistakable. Its enormous propeller, its inverted gull wings, its speed. The aircraft didn't look like anything else in the Pacific. A mythology soon grew around it. One of the most famous claims is that Japanese forces called the Corsair Whistling Death because of the distinctive sound it produced at high speed. The nickname became inseparable from the aircraft's legend. Whether Japanese pilots actually used it widely is far less certain. But the fact that the story survived tells us something important. By the end of the war, the Corsair had acquired a reputation so fearsome that people wanted to believe the enemy had named it. The legend was beginning to catch up with the machine. But while its legend was growing over the Pacific, one problem still remained unresolved. It still wasn't fighting from the carriers it had been built to defend. Some pilots became famous with it, perhaps none more than Gregory "Pappy" Boyington. Boyington commanded Marine Fighting Squadron 5 MF-214, the famous Black Sheep Squadron. He was aggressive, experienced, and controversial. Flying Corsairs from island bases, Boyington and his squadron became closely associated with the fighter's growing reputation. Boyington was credited with 28 aerial victories during his career, including victories from his earlier service with the American Volunteer Group in China. But the Corsair's success wasn't the achievement of one famous ace. That would miss the larger story. Across the Pacific, ordinary marine pilots were discovering that the aircraft gave them something American aviators had desperately wanted since 1941: control. They could decide when to attack. They could often decide when to disengage. And against the Zero, that changed everything. Yet there was an irony at the center of the Corsair's success. The better it performed from land bases, the stranger the Navy's decision looked. This was supposed to be a carrier fighter. It had been designed from the beginning to protect American fleets. Instead, the Hellcat was increasingly filling that role. The Corsair was fighting from islands. The aircraft hadn't failed. Quite the opposite. It was proving itself to be one of the most formidable fighters America possessed. But the original problem remained. How do you safely land it on a carrier? Vought continued. Improving the aircraft. Changes to the landing gear reduced its tendency to bounce. Modifications improved low-speed behavior. The cockpit was raised on later variants, improving visibility. Pilots became more familiar with its unusual characteristics. Slowly, the Corsair was becoming easier to manage. But one of the most important solutions wouldn't come from Vought. It would come from pilots operating thousands of miles away. The British Fleet Air Arm needed fighters. Britain received Corsairs and began preparing them for carrier operations. There was just one obvious problem. British carriers were generally smaller than their American counterparts. If the Corsair was already considered difficult to land on a large American carrier, putting it onto a smaller British flight deck sounded almost absurd. Yet the British couldn't afford to waste such a powerful fighter. So instead of abandoning the Corsair, they changed the way they landed it. British pilots developed and refined a curving approach. Instead of lining up far behind the carrier and flying directly toward the stern, where the Corsair's enormous nose blocked the pilot's view, they approached in a continuous turn. By keeping the carrier off to the side of the nose for much of the approach, the pilot could keep the deck and landing signals in sight. Only at the final moment did the aircraft straighten out. It was simple. But it attacked one of the Corsair's biggest weaknesses directly: visibility. They hadn't redesigned the fighter. They had redesigned the approach. Suddenly, the fighter that had seemed so awkward around carriers became much more manageable, and the British began proving something the US Navy had once doubted. The Corsair really could operate effectively from a carrier. By 1944, the situation was becoming impossible to ignore. The Marines had proven the Corsair could fight. Combat had proven it could defeat the Zero when flown correctly. Engineering changes had improved its handling, and British pilots had demonstrated how its landing problems could be overcome. The fighter America had struggled to use from the sea was running out of weaknesses. And that mattered, because the Pacific War was moving closer to Japan. American carriers were pushing deeper into enemy territory. Kamikaze attacks would soon threaten entire fleets. The Navy needed every high-performance fighter it could get. The Corsair had spent the first half of its war proving everyone wrong from land bases. Now it was about to return to the place it had been designed for from the beginning, the aircraft carrier. And when it did, the Corsair would face a kind of threat its designers could never have imagined when they first drew the aircraft in 1938. The Corsair that finally reached American carrier decks was not the same machine the Navy had struggled with years earlier. The aircraft had improved. The pilots had improved. And most importantly, they now knew how to use it. The Corsair hadn't suddenly become easy to land, but its problems were no longer enough to keep it away from the fleet. And that opened an entirely new chapter. Until this point, the Corsair's reputation had largely been built by Marine squadrons operating from island airfields. Now it could travel with the carriers themselves. That meant range, mobility, and enormous striking power. A carrier task force could move hundreds of miles through the Pacific and bring Corsairs with it. One day, they could protect the fleet. The next, they could sweep enemy fighters from the sky. Then they could attack airfields, shipping, troop positions, or supply depots. The Corsair was no longer simply a fighter. It was becoming something far more valuable. A fighter bomber. Under its wings, the aircraft could carry bombs and rockets. That transformed the Corsair into a weapon Japanese forces encountered not only in the sky but on the ground. A typical mission could begin with Corsairs escorting bombers toward an enemy island. If Japanese fighters appeared, the Corsairs could engage them. Once the air threat disappeared, those same aircraft could descend and attack ground positions, fuel dumps, artillery batteries, vehicles, buildings, ships. Then they could return to the fleet, land, rearm, and do it again. That flexibility became increasingly important as American forces pushed toward the Japanese home islands. Because the closer American forces came to Japan, the less the Corsair's job would resemble a traditional fighter mission. For the Marines fighting below, the Corsair became especially valuable. Pacific islands were often defended by networks of bunkers, cups, trenches, and fortified positions. Destroying them could be brutally difficult. Naval gunfire helped, artillery helped, but aircraft could respond quickly and strike targets that ground forces couldn't easily reach. Corsairs arrived carrying bombs and rockets, attacked Japanese positions, then disappeared back toward their bases or carriers. The aircraft, originally designed to hunt fighters, was now functioning as flying artillery. And its powerful R-2800 engine allowed it to carry increasingly heavy loads without surrendering the performance pilots needed to survive. Then came Iwo Jima. In February 1945, American Marines landed on an island only a few miles long. What followed was some of the fiercest fighting of the entire Pacific War. Japanese defenders had transformed Iwo Jima into a fortress. Bunkers covered the island. Artillery positions were hidden underground. Miles of tunnels allowed defenders to appear where American troops least expected them. Corsairs flew close support missions over the battlefield, attacking positions ahead of advancing Marines. It was dangerous work. Pilots operated close to the ground. Targets were often near friendly forces. Accuracy mattered. The aircraft, once criticised for being difficult to handle around a carrier deck, was now being asked to place weapons close to American troops fighting below. But an even greater test was approaching: Okinawa. When American forces invaded in April 1945, they were closer to the Japanese home islands than ever before. Japan responded with one of the most desperate weapons of the war: the kamikaze. Pilots deliberately flew bomb-laden aircraft into American ships. Destroying the aircraft was no longer enough if it happened too late. A damaged kamikaze could still continue toward its target. One successful impact could kill dozens or even hundreds of sailors. American fighters had to intercept them as far from the fleet as possible. Suddenly, the Corsair's speed, firepower, range and climbing ability became vital. Combat air patrols circled above the fleet for hours. Radar operators searched for incoming formations. When Japanese aircraft appeared, Corsairs were directed toward them. There was no time for elaborate dogfighting. The goal was simple: find them, destroy them. Do it before they reach the ships. The Corsair's 6.50 caliber machine guns were devastating in that role. A burst into a lightly built Japanese aircraft could tear it apart before it reached the fleet. And if the first attack failed, the Corsair had the speed to reposition and attack again. The irony was extraordinary. Only a few years earlier, the Navy had hesitated to use the Corsair from carriers because it was considered too difficult to land safely. Now, Corsairs were flying from those same carrier decks to save them from destruction. By this stage of the war, the Zero was no longer the opponent it had been in 1941. The aircraft itself remained dangerous. But Japan had lost something far more difficult to replace: experienced pilots. The elite aviators who had attacked Pearl Harbor and dominated the early Pacific campaigns had been steadily lost at Coral Sea, Midway, Guadalcanal, the Solomons, and the Philippine Sea. Their replacements often entered combat with dramatically less training. America had moved in the opposite direction, producing trained pilots, aircraft and carriers on a scale Japan could no longer match. The Corsair wasn't winning because of engineering alone. By now, everything around it, the training, the numbers, the carriers, was amplifying what it could do. By the final months of the war, the Corsair had become almost unrecognizable from the aircraft the Navy had once worried might never become an effective carrier fighter. It intercepted enemy aircraft, escorted bombers, attacked ships, strafed airfields, protected fleets, supported troops on the ground. Few fighters could perform so many missions without sacrificing the qualities that had made them successful in the first place. And production reflected that success. Thousands of Corsairs were being built not only by Vought, but under license by Brewster and Goodyear to meet wartime demand. The fighter America had once struggled to use, America now couldn't get enough of. Its combat reputation was equally impressive. Corsair units were credited with thousands of enemy aircraft destroyed during the Second World War, while suffering far fewer losses in aerial combat. But statistics alone don't explain why pilots loved it. For the men inside the cockpit, the Corsair offered something more important: options. If the enemy wanted to turn, the Corsair didn't have to follow. If the fight became dangerous, it could dive away. If a target appeared below, it could attack it. If the aircraft took damage, its rugged construction and radial engine offered a chance of getting home. A fighter pilot rarely controlled everything that happened in combat. The Corsair gave him more choices, and choices kept pilots alive. Then, in August 1945, the war ended. Japan surrendered. The aircraft the Corsair had originally been designed to defeat were grounded. The carriers returned home. Across the world, thousands of wartime aircraft suddenly became unnecessary. Technology was advancing at an astonishing rate. Jet fighters were already appearing, propeller-driven aircraft that had seemed extraordinary only a few years earlier were beginning to look obsolete. By every normal measure, the Corsair's story should have ended there. It had survived rejection, defeated the Zero, returned to the carriers that once struggled to accept it, and helped carry the war all the way to Japan. That would have been enough to make it legendary. But the Corsair was about to do something almost none of its wartime rivals could. It was going to survive the war that created it. And just a few years later, this supposedly outdated propeller fighter would find itself fighting in a world of jets. Then, in 1950, war erupted again. This time, in Korea. And part of the reason the Corsair was still there was simple. The Corsair had become far more than a fighter. Its enormous Pratt & Whitney R2800 gave it the power to carry heavy weapons. Its rugged construction allowed it to absorb punishment. Its range made it useful across enormous distances. And its speed meant that even while carrying bombs and rockets, it remained a formidable combat aircraft. The very characteristics that had made it dangerous to Japanese fighters now made it valuable in an entirely different kind of war. So while many famous wartime fighters disappeared rapidly from frontline service, Corsairs remained. Production continued after World War II. Improved versions received more powerful engines, heavier armament, and greater payload capacity. The fighter that had almost been rejected was still evolving. The battlefield had changed dramatically. Jet fighters were now operational. Aircraft like the MiG-15 could fly hundreds of miles per hour faster than the Corsair. A propeller fighter designed before Pearl Harbor had no business surviving in that environment. At least, that's what the specifications suggested. But the Corsair had another job to do. Instead of chasing jets high above Korea, it went down low. Very low. Corsairs attacked enemy troop concentrations, supply lines, artillery, trucks, railways, bridges. They carried bombs and rockets into valleys where jet aircraft were often less suited to providing precise support. And once again, the Corsair became flying artillery for soldiers on the ground. The aircraft that had once hunted Zeros was now attacking armies in the age of jet warfare. And remarkably, it could still defend itself. In 1952, Corsair pilot Jesse Vollmar was credited with shooting down a MiG-15 during an encounter over Korea. The MiG was vastly faster. Technologically, it belonged to another generation, yet a Corsair still managed to destroy one. It was an extraordinary moment. But it wasn't the reason the Corsair remained valuable. Its true strength had always been adaptability. That adaptability explains why the Corsair's career lasted so long. More than 12,000 were eventually built across all versions. Production continued until the early 1950s. Corsairs served not only with the United States, but with countries around the world. Some remained in military service long after the aircraft that had once fought against them had disappeared. The machine designed in the 1930s had survived into an entirely different era of aviation. And that brings us back to the contradiction at the center of its story. How did an aircraft America once struggled to use become one of the most legendary fighters ever built? Because the early critics weren't completely wrong. The Corsair really did have problems. Its carrier landing characteristics were difficult. The long nose really did restrict visibility. Early landing gear really could bounce. Its low-speed behavior demanded respect. Pilots really were killed in accidents. Turning the Corsair into an effective carrier aircraft required engineering changes, better training, experience, and new techniques. The legend becomes more impressive when those problems aren't ignored. Because Vought hadn't built a perfect fighter. It had built an aircraft with extraordinary potential and serious flaws. Instead of throwing it away, people learned how to unlock that potential. Engineers improved the machine. Pilots changed how they flew it. British aviators helped refine carrier techniques. American Marines proved its combat value from land. And eventually, the Navy reconsidered what the aircraft could become. The Corsair's story wasn't about perfection, it was about potential. Potential that could easily have been wasted. But instead of abandoning a difficult aircraft, pilots and engineers kept pushing until combat revealed what the Corsair could really do. The Corsair wasn't legendary because it never failed. It became legendary because failure almost ended its story, before its story had truly begun. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe, because there are still hundreds of aircraft, forgotten missions, and engineering decisions from World War II whose real stories are stranger than the legends. But before you go, I want you to make a choice. It's 1944. You're flying over the Pacific, and you can take only one fighter into combat. The Corsair, the Hellcat, or the P-38 Lightning. Which one are you choosing, and why? Tell me below, and I'll see you in the next one.